Hi, everyone. For our presentation today, we are going to integrate 4 different theories to make some novel claims about the assessment and intervention of a client who is a young female veteran returning from an 18-month tour in Afghanistan. Next slide. Today, we will be integrating Arnett's theory of emerging adulthood, theories of identity and belonging, Erikson's theory of psychosocial development, and role exits or transition theory. Next slide. So our first novel claim is that young people who enlist in the military may miss out on tasks and experiences of emerging adulthood, leading to identity confusion during the transition to civilian life and early adulthood. Arnett posited that emerging adulthood, which is the stage between adolescence and early adulthood, is a time marked by excitement and exploration, but also anxiety and uncertainty. Emerging adulthood represents a time before serious commitments are made to intimate relationships or careers. It is a time of identity exploration, self-focus, feeling in between, and optimism and hope. When a person enlists in the military at age 18, they may miss out on this developmental stage because they have already made a huge commitment to the military and do not have the time or circumstances to be self-focused or explore. This can potentially result in the delay of tasks of later stages of adulthood as well. Furthermore, the process of military acculturation is intended to replace a civilian identity with a military identity, including the displacement of norms and expectations and instilling a belief that recruits belong to the military. This includes an enforcement of codes and behavior rules, demands for unit cohesion, and submission to hierarchical authority. It is important to take into consideration the ways in which veterans negotiate this relationship with their military identity and belonging when they return to civilian life. Next slide. Thank you. When young adults return from war, they face disruptions to developmental tasks of early adulthood due to the occurrence of several difficult role transitions and experiences of war. Role exits and transitions theory aims to understand how people transition from environments and roles and how these exits shape expectations and transitions. In terms of military service, this theory can be used to focus on the experiences of servicemen and women who are making the transition from military life to civilian life and the influence of the military on their resuming of civilian roles. This theory, in combination with theories of belonging and identity that we just spoke about, can explain why the transition back to civilian life can be so difficult. To many servicemen and women, the transition back to civilian life can feel more than just a roles transition. It can actually begin to feel like a whole identity transition. This identity confusion can be magnified by the fact that servicemen and women who enlist at age 18 may miss out on the identity exploration that typically takes place during emerging adulthood. Without the time spent during that stage to solidify identity can become even more unstable than it already is when people face major role transitions. And then we'll go to our third novel claim, which is that young veterans returning from war may experience a particularly difficult psychosocial tension between intimacy and isolation in early adulthood. With Erikson's theory of psychosocial development, he posited that at each developmental stage of life, we experience a psychosocial crisis in which there is tension between two opposing experiences. In early adulthood, this psychosocial tension is between intimacy and isolation. During this stage, the major conflict centers on forming intimate, loving relationships with other people rather than submitting to isolation. When we consider young adults in the military, they often form an intensely intimate bond with their fellow recruits. However, it can be difficult to navigate the psychosocial tension when returning to civilian life, where a veteran may not be surrounded by their military companions and may feel as though civilians do not fully understand them and what they have gone through. So next we'll move on to the next slide and I'll talk a bit about our client today. So our case today is the case of Shelia Henderson, and Shelia is a 28-year-old woman who is Caucasian. Her background is that she comes from a lower middle class family in West Virginia that struggles financially. Her family is made up of her 8-year-old daughter who lives with Sheila's 30-year-old boyfriend. And they've been separated for the past 18 months while Shelia has been on deployment. So they have not seen each other or been together physically, but they have had nightly family video calls that have been set up by Sheila's boyfriend. As for Sheila's military history, she enlisted right out of high school around age 18 and has served 2 tours in Afghanistan. As I mentioned before, she is now returning from her most recent tour of 18 months. And while she was in Afghanistan, she did sustain a closed head injury, although it was deemed minor. The human development and functioning challenges that we observe in Sheila are first some nervousness or apprehension about the transition back to family life. And this nervousness is being experienced both by Sheila and by her boyfriend, who is the caretaker of Sheila's daughter. And this is due to the fact that Sheila's been gone so long and new family rules and routines have been established. And Sheila's daughter has also undergone quite a bit of developmental change since Sheila's been gone. Sheila also notes that she's been experiencing some survivor's guilt or feeling guilty that she's having negative feelings, while she knows that other people in Afghanistan have suffered much more than she has. She's also noted a change in ability to manage emotions, noting that she seems to be set off by minor inconveniences, which didn't used to happen, an inability to concentrate, frustration, anger, and resentment related to missing out on time with friends and family while she was gone, as well as a sense of helplessness about her community in West Virginia. So moving on to the next slide. So these novel claims that we just made hold a great deal of significance when we consider assessment for returning veterans in general, as well as for Sheila. In general, as veterans attempt to integrate back into into civilian and family life, they may face emotional and psychological challenges. These challenges are due in part to the major role transition that occurs when returning from a deployment, the reconciliation of two seemingly separate military and civilian identities, and an augmented psychosocial tension between intimacy and isolation caused by those conflicting roles and identities between military and civilian life. Many people initially only consider symptoms of PTSD when assessing returning veterans, which is a disservice to the client. Veterans need to be assessed for challenges associated with identity, transitions, and relationships, along with symptoms related to trauma exposure. Specifically, when we talk about Sheila, she faces several logistical, psychological, and emotional challenges upon her return to civilian and family life due to several factors, including her inability to complete the tasks of emerging adulthood while on tour in Afghanistan, the formation of a military identity that may not be readily transferable back to civilian and family life, and a heightened psychosocial tension between intimacy and isolation, fueled by difficult role transitions between military and family life. Some of these challenges include apprehension on Sheila and her boyfriend's part about her transition back to family life, survivor's guilt, a decreased ability to effectively manage emotions, and frustration, anger, and resentment due to missed time with family and friends. It will be essential for the clinician to assess the ways in which these difficulties have the potential to impact her transition back to civilian life and the ways in which the negative impacts associated can be mitigated. Now I'll pass it on to Kenzie Rose, who will go into a bit more detail in the discussion of Sheila's presenting problems and their theoretical basis.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Caitlin. All right, so we're going to focus a little bit more on assessment now. So first, we'll need to return to our first novel claim that early adults returning from deployment may face an identity crisis that disrupts normative functioning for two main reasons. One is their inability to explore identity during emerging adulthood. And then the second would be the extreme role transition between military roles and civilian roles. So our assertion related to Sheila here is that her enlistment during early adulthood led to a delay of identity development and subsequent identity confusion after her return from her deployment. When an individual enlists in the Army at age 18, they miss out on emerging adulthood, which is time marked by self-focus and identity exploration before serious commitments to careers or partners are made. And so when a person is unable to explore their identity due to time serving in the military, they may not be ready to move on to certain developmental tasks of early adulthood. So one major task of early adulthood is the development of emotional stability. So the combination of being unable to complete the task of emerging adulthood before transitioning into early adulthood, combined with the potential traumatic experiences Sheila endured during her deployments may be associated with her decreased ability to manage her emotions and her tendency to be set off by minor inconveniences as of lately. So just kind of tying it back to that PTSD and some of those symptoms that may come along with it. So second, as Caitlin mentioned earlier, the process of military acculturation is intended to replace a civilian identity with a military identity, essentially instilling a belief that recruits belong to the military. This includes an enforcement of codes and behavior rules, demands for unit cohesion, and submission to a hierarchical authority. So just sort of like some of those power dynamics come into play. Um, because this identity does not serve an individual as well in civilian life, but because individuals have not had the time during the years of emerging adulthood to explore their civilian identities, this can just sort of cause a great deal of identity confusion, sort of as we talked about earlier. So this has the potential to prevent Sheila from completing one essential normative task of early adulthood, which is the commitment to an intimate relationship. Evidence has shown that identity achievement mediates the ability to develop an intimate relationship in early adulthood. Therefore, Sheila's identity confusion could cause challenges in adjusting back to family life and connecting with her boyfriend. This could have contributed to Sheila's apprehension about her transition back into her relationship and motherhood as a civilian. So if you'll go on to the next slide. So we will now return to our second novel claim, in which we stated that young veterans returning from deployment may experience disruptions to normative tasks of early adulthood due to role transitions and experiences of war. Our assertion here is that Sheila's transition from her military role to a family and civilian role, accompanied by those symptoms of PTSD, have interrupted the completion of several developmental tasks of early adulthood. You can kind of see a lot of the connections here. So research shows that 49% of veterans report post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD, or some variation of that. It's going to look different for everybody. PTSD can have impacts on many aspects of normative functioning in early adulthood. First, symptoms of PTSD can impede full participation in intimate relationships due mainly to the emotional numbing that can often be a symptom of individuals with PTSD. This could affect her relationship with her boyfriend and her daughter. So another symptom of PTSD is that survivor's guilt, kind of like what we were talking about with Caitlin earlier. Um, a feeling of guilt for living on or escaping death while others lost their lives after the experience of a traumatic event, something that many of us probably haven't experienced, but if we have, that can be very traumatic to go through, to say the least. And so Sheila notes that she feels guilty for dwelling on her own challenges when others suffered much worse than she did in Afghanistan. And just having that empathy, I think that would be very difficult to go through that and experience that. So the role transitions from soldier to civilian and motherhood can also cause disruptions to normative tasks of early adulthood. Um, the normative tasks of early adulthood include establishing autonomy, committing to a partner, child rearing, establishing a career, developing emotional stability, and becoming part of a group or community. That belonging. So while we already have briefly discussed the impacts on commitment to an intimate partner and the development of emotional stability, being deployed also makes the establishment of autonomy, a career, and civilian group membership belonging more difficult, which can emphasize cooperation and group identity. It can be difficult to establish a sense of individualism and autonomy upon returning to civilian life, essentially. Because the military was Sheila's career for the past 8 years, she may struggle to decide on a future career path, and to establish herself in a career unless she decides to enter another period of deployment. I'm so sorry. So lastly, it may be difficult for Sheila to find a group or community that she feels like she belongs to. Kind of like what we touched on earlier. So she may just feel as though she has irreconcilable differences with many civilians, um, without that affinity of mutual experiences potentially. And so maybe they can't understand what she's been through, which is understandable. This may explain Sheila's resentment about loss, time with family and friends. And so she likely craves the intimacy of civilian family members and friends, but she just unfortunately feels unable to achieve it. So if we go on to the next slide. Um, so kind of thinking back to our third novel claim, wherein we claim that early adult veterans returning from war may experience a heightened psychosocial tension between intimacy and isolation, which Erickson describes as the principal tension of this developmental stage. Our specific assertion about Sheila here is that Sheila is experiencing increased psychosocial tension between isolation and intimacy due to her role transition from soldier to civilian. So even though Sheila has already established an intimate relationship and has begun to rear a child, which are normative tasks of early adulthood and are centered around intimacy, the role transitions involved in transitioning from military life to family life augment the tension between intimacy and isolation. Um, so there's a lot of connection there. So when Sheila was deployed, she likely experienced profound intimacy with her fellow servicemen and women, which is interesting to note. Thinking about how as many Army recruits from they form very close bonds with one another. They're in very close proximity. So, however, Sheila was also physically and emotionally isolated from her boyfriend and daughter at this time. So thinking about how that might have a negative effect. And so when Sheila returns to that civilian life, the roles are going to shift there. It is inevitable. She will be physically isolated from the servicemen and women with whom she formed close bonds, and she feels understood by, and will be trying to reestablish intimacy with her boyfriend and daughter. So just kind of going back to that idea that people in the civilian world may not necessarily understand what she went through, as opposed to the servicemen and women who she served alongside with. So this tension is likely related to Sheila's apprehension about her transition back to living with her family, as well as frustration and resentment about missed time with family and friends. So kind of reflecting back on all of that, it could also be linked with Sheila's experience to that survivor's guilt that we sort of discussed. When she transitions from active duty to veteran civilian life, she may feel physically isolated from those who understand what she has been through. She may feel a desire to connect with her loved ones, but also feel though they cannot understand the things that she has seen and experienced while overseas. This feeling of isolation may lead to a feeling of guilt because she is experiencing these negative feelings, even though she has been able to return to civilian life and to a loving family, yet probably knows many people who are not so lucky as to return back home alive or without serious injuries. So a lot to process, a lot to think about. Now we're going to move on to Jackie, who's going to talk about intervention.
Thank you, Kenzie and Caitlin. So as Kenzie mentioned, we're going to start talking about intervention now. So kind of what we can do with all the information that we've laid out. So based on our assessment, we formulated an assertion in regards to Sheila's treatment. We think in order to treat Sheila's logistical, psychological, and emotional challenges upon returning to civilian and family life, there are a few symptoms that need to be addressed. So first, this apprehension that Sheila and her boyfriend have that we've touched on a lot throughout our presentation about the transition into the family life. Sheila's boyfriend has concerns regarding some reintegration to the daily routines, and Sheila's wary of this as well. Secondly, Sheila must address her identity crisis. It's been once again discussed throughout the presentation that Sheila is going to be struggling to create this civilian identity after having invested so much time in her military identity after her 2 terms of serving. This has caused to her a struggle to have intimacy in her family relationships, and she's battling with potential isolation. Third, Sheila's shown symptoms of survivor guilt, as we've mentioned before. This guilt is really impacting all areas of her life and emphasizes this idea of identity confusion. Although she should be happy to be home with her boyfriend and child, she does not feel this way, and she's frustrated that she doesn't feel this way because she knows that she could have it worse. Fourth, Sheila's been having a hard time regulating her emotions, and this is impacting her relationship with her family. This is most likely due to experiences of combat and as well the stressful transition she's now going through. And this is also seen as part of the PTSD symptoms along with that survivor's guilt. Lastly, Sheila holds resentment due to time she missed with her family. And once again, she feels that she should be happy to be home. But this transition has still been very hard on her. So through intervention, we can hopefully help Sheila and her family to achieve a different mindset and develop tools and strategies to make the reintegration process more feasible for them. So we've created some treatment goals based off of that assertion for Sheila. So the first is to increase the confidence in her and her family have regarding the reintegration process, and through that increase their bonds and communication. So communication is going to be huge for their entire family, but more specifically between Sheila and her partner. It'll help them to discuss the apprehension they have and any sort of tension. The second goal is to improve Sheila's ability to manage and express her emotions. So this goal is going to be targeted through a multitude of inventions just based on different mental health things, but also specifically targeting those frustrations and angers that she has. The third goal is to further formulate her civilian identity. So really trying to help her feel less isolated and understand who she is within this new context. This will help her to feel more confident and comfortable, and therefore lead to better relationships and intimacy. Going off of that, the fourth claim is to increase intimacy in her relationships. So through identity development, she'll be better able to communicate with her partner and know herself better in order to engage with that sort of intimate relationship. Lastly, we'll work to treat PTSD symptoms that Sheila's facing. Some of the symptoms relate to her emotions as well as her intimacy. But the guilt she feels for the veterans who do not have what she has or lost their lives to combat must be addressed as well. So both that survivor guilt as well as those symptoms of her reactions of frustration and anger that she's been having come up a lot. So to move on to the first intervention, this one is called After Deployment Adaptive Parenting Tools, or ADAPT. So it was based off of a parent management training Oregon model is what it's called, which was created for to support mothers that were going through hard transitions like divorce or separation. But it's been updated to tailor specifically to military families and the reintegration, hence the name. So it's really just about creating positive relationships within the family and helping that parent that's reintegrating to find their place in the parenting lifestyle. So they touch on 5 basic skills, which are skill encouragement. So teaching your child through encouragement, and these are parenting skills. Positive involvement, so between the parent and the child. family problem solving, so all working together, monitoring your child, and effective discipline. So in the process of teaching these skills to help the parents adapt, they also acknowledge that there's specific circumstances that come with reintegration that they touch on throughout the trainings. They understand that military culture differs from the family culture. So there's a need for specific types of training. And this will really aid Shelia because it understands that she's struggling with that identity crisis. Then it also acknowledges how previous experiences while in combat may impact parental reactions, so such as Sheila's frustration and anger that she's been having. So they understand that Shelia and other military parents have been trained to be reactive and in survival mode constantly. So this could come up in parenting when they make harsh reactions to things, and it's not necessary when you're parenting necessarily. So just about changing that emotional response. And lastly, they pay much attention towards parental communication and being on the same page, which clearly is going to be huge for Shelia and her boyfriend because Shelia is, they both have hesitation about her returning and how she'll fit into their daily routines. So by being on the same page, this will help ease the tension. The parents are also taught mindfulness skills, which would be super beneficial. So it teaches them how to stay in the moment and be attentive to their family members to better communicate and build relationships. And she'll be more present and able to emotionally respond to all of her family's needs at this point. So as I kind of mentioned before, these skills will allow Shelia to be involved in the parenting that she has felt like she's missed out on while she was deployed, and help her and her boyfriend to be on the same page about what their routine and family model will look like. Hopefully through this as well, Shelia will develop some more intimacy and family bonding through this intense communication and feeling like they're all working together. So the next set of intervention that we found was the enrichment equation by Team Red, White, and Blue, which is an organization that's meant to like supplement things that the VA offers. So they created this equation that's enrichment equals health plus people plus purpose. So this is the entire idea behind this program. So they all base all their programs specifics on positive psychology and strengths-based theories. So they emphasize all the positive attributes and strengths that the individual or military member has to bring. And then they also use social resiliency frameworks that states connections matter and they enhance an individual's mental health and quality of life. So two really important things for Shelia. So the first aspect is health. They focus on 3 types of health: physical, mental, and emotional. The first is physical, which can be any sort of recreational or sport. And they find that this improves the military members' mental health. And they also understand that fitness is a part of the military culture. So it's kind of a way to maintain that comfortability and a sense of their routine while also being in the civilian world and helping their mental state. The next is mental health. So they focus on mental health, but without a stigma lens. So they really steer clear of using like mental illness terms such as PTSD. And they talk about things like anxiety, irritability, nervous, anger, depression, impaired cognition. So all those things that Shelia has been experiencing, but she may benefit from steering clear of a stigma-based intervention. So the last one is emotional health, which emphasizes positive achievement and gratitude, as well as like-mindedness and open-mindedness. So the program staff really helps members to see this, see their positive attributes and what they can bring to communities, and really helps them form their sense of identity. So this would help Shelia to see her positive attributes and deter her maybe from that sense of guilt, and further develop her identity and who she is. The second part of the equation is people. So the program really aims to form authentic bonds between the people that are in the program and also the staff members. So they also engage with other members of the community. So they bring in the individual's family members, they bring in typical civilians and community health professionals. So this really could push Sheila and many other veterans from that sense of isolation and allow them to build deeper relationships with their family, but also with outside connection. So really getting them involved with the civilian identity. It'll positively impact their mental health by lessening that feeling of isolation and push away that sense of depression or that feeling of depression due to a lack of belonging and identity crisis. So once Sheila kind of feels like she belongs somewhere within the civilian world, she'll be better able to have a sense of who she is. And going off of that, the last aspect is purpose, which refers to an intentional and goal-directed behavior. So the military, as we've talked about before, really gives individuals a goal and a purpose in life, really patriotism and serving your country. So the enrichment equation works to create civilian-centered purpose and identity by working with others and promoting leadership opportunities for the veterans within their new communities. So they focus on like helping the individual to find, I'm forgetting my word, volunteer opportunities within the community so that they can have that sense of responsibility, and they find that it leads to meaning and life satisfaction for individuals. They also focus on the group cohesion of the enrichment equation organization, so really forming that bond among all of them and sharing unity. So through purpose, meaning, and togetherness, Sheila can further develop this civilian identity and explore what life looks like for her post-service. This will help her to be more mentally stable and available for her family relationships. So the last one we'll talk about is behavioral conjoint therapy. So this is a combination of behavioral and cognitive behavioral therapy, and it's specifically for PTSD treatment. And it's used among couples, so it treats the PTSD symptoms as well as the couple's relationship. And this is found to be a super influential intervention for couples. So that's why we've chosen it for Sheila, as we think that it'll really help to not only help her with those PTSD symptoms of the emotional regulation and that survivor's guilt, but it also really help to increase the intimacy she is lacking with her boyfriend and in her life in general. So the first part of the therapy focuses on educating the couples regarding PTSD symptoms and the implications for relationships. And also focus on coping mechanisms to positively deal with the symptoms. So the therapy focuses on trauma in a broad sense. So not to get the couples too emotionally invested and have high emotional reactions. So they steer clear of that typical PTSD treatment. And they specifically discuss the nervous system and the science behind the PTSD symptoms and an individual's reactions. The second stage focuses on improving communication between the couple. So the goal is to positively enhance and talk through issues related to the relationship as well as PTSD. By talking through their emotions and needs, the couple is able to shrink the presence of PTSD and create a plan of how to address their problems and create actions to improve them. And then the last stage of the cognitive development and improving thinking surrounding PTSD symptoms the last stage focuses on cognitive development and improving thinking surrounding PTSD symptoms in the relationship. So in order to do this, the therapy incorporates a strategy called Unstuck, which is a step-by-step process for couples to engage with when they're trying to communicate. So it really engages with that cognitive thinking and trying to get couples out of this like stuck position and express their emotions and think about and communicate each of their thoughts so that they can come to a more clear sense of thinking. So really, once again, focuses on that cognitive and that emotional interaction, which would be super beneficial to Sheila and her boyfriend as they're working to reintegrate and also trying to form that sense of intimacy. So to tie it all together, we're going to refer back to our novel claims. So the first one is young people who enlist in the military may miss out on tasks and experiences of emerging adulthood, leading to identity confusion during the transition to civilian life and early adulthood. So intervention will really help to bridge the gap between that military and civilian identity that Sheila's been struggling with and potentially make up for the lack of exploration in her emerging adulthood stage. The next was when young veterans return from war, they may face disruptions to development tasks of early adulthood due to the occurrence of several difficult role transitions and experiences of war. So the interventions mentioned will help Shelia to improve her intimate relationships and increase her involvement with people outside of her family, which were impacted when she was deployed. So the expanding and deepening of her community will allow her to establish a sense of belonging, leading her to an improved emotional state and cognitive functioning. And lastly, young veterans returning from war experience a particularly difficult psychosocial tension between intimacy and isolation in early adulthood. So these interventions will allow Shelia to feel more confident in herself and her identity, leading to more positive relationships and an improved well-being. Now I'll pass it over to Caitlin to go ahead with the conclusion.
Great, thank you. So through this presentation, we explored several ways in which early adult veterans returning from deployment can be impacted by the role transitions they face when integrating back into family and civilian life. We talked about the possibility of identity confusion and increased psychosocial tension between isolation and intimacy, the possible experience of extended periods of stress and trauma, and how these can all interact to create several obstacles for veterans returning to civilian life. We saw that with our client Shelia, this manifested by creating a difficulty in emotion management, survivor's guilt, feelings of isolation, frustration, and resentment, and a nervousness about the transition back into family life. In order to combat these symptoms, we recommended that Shelia attend ADAPT sessions, get involved with her local Red, White, and Blue chapter to get involved with the EEQ program, and attend CBCT therapy with her boyfriend. These interventions will allow Shelia to form her civilian identity within her family and community at large. Furthermore, it will allow her to be able to get into touch with her emotional states and work towards improved mental health and intimate relationships. In closing, we'd like to leave you with some food for thought. So while the majority of veterans look favorably on their military experience, the majority also report difficulty adjusting back to civilian life, which can lead to larger problems such as joblessness, homelessness, and untreated mental health conditions. As we explored treatment plans for veterans returning from war and military families in general, we didn't come across many well-established interventions. It mainly seems to be focused on symptoms of PTSD. While these interventions can be helpful for many veterans, veterans also face other difficulties when returning to civilian life other than symptoms of trauma or stress, such as extreme role transitions and identity confusion. So our question to you is, how do you think we can commit to better serving military families and veterans in this sense as social workers? And that's all we have for you. So thank you guys for listening.
Thank you all so much. There are references. Thank you.
Mhm.